A young boy looks Hyena right in the eye and tells her that he wants her to become his retainer one day. It was 10 years ago when this all started. The boy was blushing like crazy back then, just remembering the way he took her hand and said those specific words. Hyena is a royal court magician who just got kicked out for a pretty unfair reason, but she's still by the prince's side. Back in the past, a young Hyena repeats his words back to him, asking if he really means a retainer of the royal court, and the boy doesn't hesitate. He tells her that's exactly right and promises he'll definitely come back for her. Then he slides a ring onto her finger. He tells her to hold onto it and make sure she never loses it. Looking at the ring now, she knows for a fact he said those words to her. The scene shifts back to the palace towers where a voice tells Hyena she's officially banished because she's just a commoner, leaving Hyena standing there in shock, repeating the word banished like she can't even believe what she's hearing. Marable, the daughter of Count Destor, looks way too happy while confirming that Hyena is officially banished, and she makes it clear that Hyena's title as a royal court magician is gone, and that she's nothing more than a commoner now. Hyena keeps her cool and asks if there's an actual reason behind all this, but Marable acts like the question is a joke. Looking back at her with total annoyance before, she starts yelling about how a lowly commoner like Hyena supposedly snuck into the palace to steal a royal mage position. She claims the only reason Hyena even got the job was because of a single recommendation from Duke Lewis Miller, and she asks what other reason could there possibly be, pointing her finger and acting completely superior. Marable keeps going, insisting that magic is a special privilege meant only for the nobility, and tells Hyena that being a royal mage isn't something a commoner should ever be doing. So Hyena just stands there and lets out a long sigh, looking completely done with Marable's drama and insults. Marable gets even nastier, laughing while she claims she doesn't know how Hyena seduced the former head mage and his grace. She keeps going, saying Hyena only used the Duke to win their favor in the first place, but Marable yells that it all ends today. Hyena just stands there, sounding confused as she repeats the word seduce, and Marable snaps back, saying that's exactly what happened and that Hyena flirted her way into his good graces. She uses that as the reason Hyena managed to become a royal court magician, which leads to her calling the Duke a complete fool for letting himself get tricked by someone like Hyena. Marable finishes the thought by telling Hyena she's an absolute disgrace to the nobility, but Hyena's vibe shifts completely. She drops the calm look and tells Marable to take that back right now. Marable is stunned into silence, just staring back because she didn't expect Hyena to actually snap at her. Hyena makes it clear that while she doesn't care what Marable has to say about her personally, she won't. Hyena looks Marable right in the eye, telling her she won't just stand by while her benefactor gets insulted. Marable is completely taken aback, yelling out in shock as she realizes Hyena is actually about to do something about it. Hyena doesn't hesitate and activates her magic, looking focused as she locks onto her target with a cold, sharp stare that shows she isn't playing around anymore. A massive burst of energy goes off, slamming Marable back and showing off Hyena's real power. Marable is totally frozen with fear, staring at the shattered wall right next to her head while— Hold up! Smash like and subscribe for more hidden manga gems. Now, I dare you to comment, I'm loving it. I bet most of you won't do it. Alright, let's continue. Hyena looks down and coldly says she's officially done with this whole situation. She closes her eyes, telling everyone that talking to people like them is just a waste of breath. So, she makes the big move and announces she's handing back her Royal Magician badge for good. As Marable watches in total silence, Hyena tells the court nobles they can go ahead and do whatever they want. Hyena holds out her royal badge and starts walking away, telling the nobles they can handle things themselves from now on. Once she's out of there, she can't help but shout about how much the whole thing pisses her off. She knows she's just a commoner, and she sits down on some rocks, thinking about how she didn't even get into the royal court through the normal way. She looks down with a sad expression, admitting to herself that the only reason she even took the job was just to look for a certain person, and she feels like that's really nothing to brag about. She looks off into the distance, calling herself an idiot for still holding onto memories from a long time ago. But as she sits alone in the woods, she can't help but wonder where the guy actually is. She remembers a young boy smiling at her, promising that he would come back to get her one day. Hyena holds her hand up to the sun to look at her ring, calling him a liar for saying he'd come pick her up when he never showed. She stares blankly, thinking about how much she hates the nobles, and how much she hates Evan for breaking that old promise. Hyena sits there by herself, thinking about how much she hates everyone even when there's nobody around to hear her. She's just venting to the empty air until some guy suddenly tells her she should keep those insults to herself, warning her that those nobles are actually pretty relentless. She completely freezes up, totally caught off guard by the fact that someone is actually watching her, and the guy admits he probably deserves to get yelled at for sneaking up on her like that. He gives her a look and says it's been a really long time, calling her by her name while she just stares back at him. She looks like she's seeing a ghost and can't move. She finally finds her voice and asks if it's really Evan standing right there in front of her. Meanwhile, back at the palace, things are starting to get pretty messy as Duke Louis Miller finds out what happened. He looks completely stressed out, asking if they actually kicked Hyuna out of the court. The attendant confirms that while the Duke was away from the palace, everything fell apart, explaining that Marable, the other nobles who hate commoners, and even Prince Ruha were all in on it. Miller looks pretty annoyed, mentioning he specifically told the prince to treat Hyuna with respect. But the attendant just stands there sweating, looking like he's afraid to even speak. He tells the Duke they claimed there was no point in having a commoner as a royal magician, saying that since she's not a noble, she shouldn't even have an aptitude for magic at all. Miller just stares off, thinking about how none of these people actually understand how serious this is. He remembers when Hyuna saved his life from monsters, acknowledging that while he did recommend her as a favor, that's not why she lasted 5 years in the court. He knows the real reason she stayed was simply because her own magical talent is on a completely different level than everyone else's. Duke Miller keeps thinking about how the former head mage, who was the best in history, specifically chose Hyuna, and she was actually the only talent that the legendary mage ever wanted to train as his one and only successor. The Duke clenches his fist, thinking about how insane it is that the kingdom just drove her out like this. He's so worked up that he slams his hand down on the desk, making a loud bang that sends the attendant into a total panic. Miller yells that those people in the palace don't understand a single thing, looking completely fed up with the idiots running the capital. He knows that soon enough, this whole country is going to realize exactly how badly they messed up by letting her go, and just how important she really was. Meanwhile, back in the field, a boy walks up to Hyuna as she turns around, recognizing him immediately. She looks totally caught off guard and asks if it's really Evan standing there. Evan just gives her a big warm smile, saying it's been 10 years and that she hasn't changed one bit. Evan thinks about how things have played out, admitting that it's a pretty harsh way to put it, and he looks over at her with a calm expression. He says that since everything was his fault, he can't really make any excuses for what happened. Hyuna is standing there completely stunned. She tries to speak, but only a tiny stutter comes out as she looks him right in the eyes. She's still trying to process everything and asks him if he really is the Evan she used to know. Evan just gives her a simple nod and says yeah, leaving Hyuna to just whisper his name while she stares back at him. A tear starts to roll down her face, and she says if that's really the case, she suddenly starts sobbing, which completely freaks Evan out. He gets all flustered and holds his hands up, saying he's really sorry for leaving her all by herself for 10 years. Evan tries to explain himself, telling her that he spent all those days agonizing over things too, mainly because he saw that she actually managed to become a royal court magician. He follows that up by saying he guesses they're even now. Hyuna just looks at him with a totally blank face, feeling completely lost as she asks him exactly what he means by that. Evan rubs the back of his neck, looking pretty stressed out as he explains the situation. He tells her to just imagine the fallout if people found out a prince from another kingdom poached a royal court magician. He keeps going, looking down while admitting that something like that would definitely cause a massive international disaster, and Hyuna just stands there with her mouth hanging open. She's totally lost, repeating the words neighboring prince like she can't even believe what she's hearing. She looks completely drained and tiny in the frame, still trying to process the fact that Evan is actually royalty from somewhere else. Evan leans in close to her, looking sincere and a bit guilty. He tells her he's really sorry for leaving her 10 years ago without ever mentioning his real identity. Hyuna stares off into the distance, feeling like her whole life has been a lie. She starts questioning what those 5 years of grinding at the royal palace were even for, which makes Evan look at her with a confused expression. He repeats the words hard work back to her, clearly not realizing the effort she put in just to find him. She takes a second to herself, thinking about how she always just assumed Evan was some local noble or something. She watches him walk ahead, still unable to wrap her head around him being a prince from the kingdom next door. She looks pretty heartbroken as the reality sets in, admitting she only pushed herself to become a royal court magician because she thought it was the only way to ever see him again. Evan looks pretty stressed out, rubbing his head as he explains his teacher made him swear to keep his royal identity a total secret. So Hyuna asks if he's talking about Professor Novus, and Evan just sighs, saying there were a lot of complicated adult reasons behind it all. He mentions he's just happy she actually kept the ring he gave her, which leaves Hyuna looking pretty surprised as she tries to find the right words. Suddenly, she flashes back to when they were kids, back to the day Evan first called out her name with that huge smile on his face. They were standing there holding hands, and she remembers him telling her that one day he wanted her to officially become his vassal. The younger Hyuna looks at him, totally confused and asks what a retainer actually is or what she would even have to do for him. Evan just grins, telling her it's super obvious because it just means she has to stay with him forever, which makes Hyuna wonder if he's really sure about this, considering they had only known each other for about 3 months at that point. Evan laughs it off and says he's positive, mostly because he's the one who wants to be around her more than anyone else. He gets this slightly worried look on his face though, wondering if all her questioning means she's actually planning on saying no. Hyuna gives him a huge smile and says being together forever sounds like a plan, thinking it sounds really nice. Evan looks completely stunned, asking if she's actually serious about staying with him, but Hyuna just grins and says it sounds like a lot of fun, which makes Evan lean in and say how great that is. The mood shifts as Evan gets serious, telling Hyuna he doesn't know when they'll actually see each other again after today, but he promises that one day when he's finally older, he will come back, so he looks her in the eye and begs her not to lose the ring he gave her. He makes a solemn promise right then and there that he's definitely coming back for her, and while he's talking, he slowly slides the ring onto her finger to make it official. Evan gives her a small, gentle smile as he finishes putting it on, leaving Hyuna staring at her hand in total awe of how beautiful the ring looks on her. Young Hyuna gives him a bright smile and waves, agreeing to the promise they just made. As they hold hands, she tells Evan she'll be waiting for him to come back one day, making the moment stick with them both. Years later, Evan mentions hearing that she really did become a royal court magician. He watches her in his mind and admits he was actually worried she'd forgotten him, but seeing the ring on her finger changed everything. Hyuna just smiles, showing off the ring she never took off through all those years. Evan looks at her with a soft expression, telling her how glad he is that she actually remembered him. She just reminds him that he was the one who told her to keep it safe, and he can't help but give her a huge, happy grin. He gets serious then, telling Hyuna he's been preparing for a whole year since he finally found her. Evan looks her right in the eye, explaining he was just waiting for the moment she finally left the palace on her own to fulfill that 10-year-old promise. Standing out in the open field, he makes it clear he's not going to force her into anything, but if she's even a little bit down for it, he wants her to officially start serving as his personal retainer today. Hyuna stands there thinking about how he left her alone for a decade, and how crazy it is that he's just showing up now out of nowhere. Her eyes start to water up as all those years of waiting hit her at once. She tells Evan he's being totally unfair, clutching her chest while Evan just stands there looking pretty nervous about how she's taking it. Hyuna looks down, thinking about how 10 years is a really long time, long enough to totally change how someone feels. And there were so many moments where she almost just gave up on everything. But even with all that time passing, she just couldn't bring herself to forget that one promise they made as kids. Evan clenches his fist tight as Hyuna speaks up and calls his name. She asks if he knows the real reason she worked so hard to become a royal court magician in the first place. Evan looks at her, softly asking if she did all that just to find him again, and Hyuna gives him a huge, relieved smile, telling him he's right and that everything is finally okay now. She gets a bit flustered though, asking if he's actually cool with her being his retainer, which he immediately says he is. Evan takes a second to get his head together and tells her he should probably reintroduce himself properly, so he looks her right in the eyes and says his full name is Evan Vel Roster II. Evan finishes his intro, making it official that he is the prince of the Roster Kingdom. Hyuna looks pretty stunned by the news, but she manages to introduce herself back. The two of them share a handshake to seal the deal on their new partnership. Evan tells her he is looking forward to them working together as they stand out in the field. Hyuna thinks back to when she was a kid, heading deep into the woods to find some wild vegetables, and remembers how that was the exact spot where she first ran into Evan. Back then, she just walked up and asked him who he was since she'd never seen him around. Then she asked what he was even doing out there in the middle of nowhere. Evan didn't really have a big reason and just told her it was nothing special, admitting he was mostly just out there because he was feeling bored. Hyuna looks at Evan sitting under the tree and asks him what he finds so boring about his life. Evan doesn't even hesitate, just looks away and says that absolutely everything is boring. He starts opening up, telling her that he's heard the same thing from everyone his whole life. People are always calling him amazing or a genius, and telling him how jealous they are of his talent. Evan looks down, saying he's sick of people constantly repeating those same empty compliments to him. He tells her straight up that the whole situation sucks, while Hyuna realizes there's nothing good about being treated like that. The kid keeps going, explaining that even with the praise, people are always actually resenting him for what he can do. He leans back against the tree, frustrated because it's not like he got to where he is without putting in a ton of effort. He wonders what the point of living even is when nobody actually understands how hard he works. Looking back at the adults who always surrounded him, he realizes they never cared about him as a person, only as a genius. Evan looks back at the time adults were always hovering over him and says nobody ever bothered to see who he really was. And that feeling of being ignored is exactly why he decided to run away. He admits that just seeing their faces made him so angry he couldn't even stand to be around them anymore. But Hina cuts in and tells him to listen, asking what even makes a genius in the first place. Evan is caught off guard as she asks if the real reason he's hurting is just because nobody gets him. She looks him right in the eye and promises that she'll be the one to finally understand him. Then she tells him he should just open up and tell her everything about himself. Evan just laughs at her, like the whole idea is ridiculous, and asks how she could possibly understand anything he's going through when she doesn't even know the first thing about how magic works. Evan thinks about the word magic for a second while Hina looks at him, asking if he finally gets what she's saying. Since she's so confident, Evan tells her she might as well teach him how to use it then, and even though he claims it's a total waste of time, he points out that she's not doing anything else right now anyway. Evan finally gives in and says fine, muttering about how she always seems to have an answer for everything. He makes it clear that he's only going to do this once, so he starts the lesson by explaining that magic is all about sensing the energy inside your own body. He tells her to concentrate all that power right into her hands and just let it fire. And right on cue, a magic circle appears and water starts blasting out. A massive pillar of water shoots into the sky as he shows off some high-level 6th-tier magic, and Hina just stands there with her mouth open, totally shocked by how amazing it looks. Evan breaks it down for Hina, telling her the real trick is to clearly visualize the exact spell she wants to use. He tells her to just go for it, and Hina gives a shaky nod. Evan watches her, thinking that if she actually pulls this off, she's a total genius. Hina closes her eyes and focuses hard, telling herself she just needs to make a water pillar. Suddenly, a magic circle flashes and she actually triggers 6th-tier water magic, which totally blows Evan's mind. He asks if she's for real, but Hina just laughs it off, thinking she wasn't as smooth as him. Evan calls her a genius and says he'll teach her mana control so she can try again. They end up losing track of time and practice until it's pitch black outside, only stopping when Professor Novus shows up to pick Evan up and scolds them both. The memory fades as the sun shines over the massive buildings of the royal capital. Hina looks out the window and loses it because she's so impressed by the view. Evan asks if this is way different from Riglud, and he's just nodding along while the carriage wheels roll over the stone road until the ride finally ends. Evan tells her they're here, and Hina steps out, completely caught off guard when Nova's Mailnard shows up to welcome them both back. Hina stands there frozen, barely able to speak since she can't believe it's actually Professor Novus standing right there. She asks if it's really him and he just smiles, saying it's been a while. Hina realizes it's been 10 years, but then she stops mid-sentence because she notices something crazy. She tells him he hasn't aged a single bit. Hina says it's nothing important, but Novus can tell something is on her mind and asks what's up. He mentions how it's been such a long time since the three of them were all together like this, and he asks Hina what she's actually been doing with her life over the last 10 years. Hina explains that because of the magic Evan and the professor taught her back in the day, she was working as a royal court magician in Rigrud, which catches Novus off guard. She gives a little awkward smile and admits a lot happened, leading to her getting banished, but she tells them she only became one to find Evan, so it's all good. Novus doesn't look happy at all, repeating the fact that she was banished with a serious look. So Hina starts waving her hands around, insisting she isn't bothered by it and everything is fine. Evan just smiles and tells her she doesn't have to worry anymore. She can finally rest easy. Evan looks her right in the eyes and promises to kick out anyone who treats her badly. Hina looks a bit worried and says that sounds like he's abusing his power. But Evan just smiles and tells her that's exactly what being in charge is for. Hina gives him a look and says if he's so okay with using his authority, then he really should have used that same power to come find her a lot sooner than he did. Evan just stands there for a second and admits he really doesn't have a comeback for that. Then a thought hits Hina and she gets this curious look on her face. She turns to Novus and asks what he and Evan have actually been doing with their time for the last 10 years. Novus keeps it vague, saying they've mostly just been preparing, while Evan tells her he'll explain the whole story to her later. Hina gives them a really skeptical look which makes Evan start to sweat, so he tries to change the subject as fast as he can, and he says since they're finally back together after all this time, he wants to take a look at something. Evan finishes his thought and says he wants to check out her magic for the first time in a long time. Hina gives him a really skeptical look and asks if he's actually serious about taking a look at her skills. She gets fired up and reminds him that she hasn't just been sitting around, she's been training her magic for 10 years too. Hina pokes him in the chest and gets competitive, telling him she might honestly be better than he is by now. Evan just gives her a smug grin, looking like he's actually pretty amused by her confidence. Hyena smiles right back and says since they're doing this, she'll be the one judging his magic instead. Evan laughs it off and says he's more than happy to take her up on that challenge, so he starts walking away and tells her they need to change locations, ordering her to follow him. Hyena doesn't back down for a second and tells him to just bring it on while Novus stands back and watches them head off, quietly calling out to Hyena as they go. Hyena looks over as Novus tells her he's really glad she decided to come back. He mentions that Evan has been smiling a whole lot more ever since the two of them met again. Novus gets a bit serious and explains that while being called a genius sounds great, it's actually a pretty lonely way to live. But he knows that as long as Hyena is staying by his side, Evan won't ever have to feel alone like that. He closes his eyes for a second and asks her to please keep supporting the young prince from now on. Hyena gives him a warm, confident smile and tells him that of course she's going to do exactly that. And just then, they make it to a clearing in the woods where Evan stops and tells her they finally arrived. There are a bunch of heavy logs stacked up on the ground in the middle of the area, and right next to them, a stone wall has a massive, cracked-out crater smashed right into the center. Chunks of broken rock and rubble are scattered everywhere across the dirt, showing just how much force was used. Hyena looks around the clearing and asks Evan where exactly they are. Evan stands there with his hands on his hips, explaining he uses this spot for magic practice. He mentions that training out here is better since he won't end up bothering anyone, and then he brings up the fact that it's been 10 years since they last met. Evan stands by the smashed stone wall, telling Hyena he thought a lot about what to do for her. He says he considered things like getting her a gift or taking her out for a nice meal, but he stops himself mid-sentence because those ideas just didn't seem to fit. Looking right at her, he explains that none of those normal things felt right for the occasion. Hyena gives him a gentle smile and says yeah, while Evan smirks and tells her that he knew it had to be this instead. Evan looks at his hand as a magic circle starts to glow, mentioning that it's been 10 years since they last did this, and he officially calls it out, telling Hyena they're having a real magic duel right here. He doesn't hold back at all, yelling out that he's starting with 6th-tier water magic while Hyena just stares him down, and the two spells collide in the center of the clearing with a massive flash of light. The impact is huge, sending water and energy everywhere as both of them stand their ground against the blast. Hyena looks through the smoke with sharp eyes, telling him that she's not even close to being done, and she throws her arms out, instantly summoning a whole bunch of magic circles around her. With a confident smirk, she calls out her multiple deployment technique to show him what she's got. Evan looks totally shocked by the sheer amount of power she's putting out so quickly, and he tries to match her by shouting for a multi-expansion, surrounding himself with his own circles to keep the fight going. Evan shouts for a multi-expansion as their massive spells collide in the middle of the field. He laughs it off and tells Hyena she's a total genius for keeping up with him like this. While surrounded by circles, he mentions how nobody is supposed to be able to use this many 6th-tier spells at once. But he isn't stopping there and tells her he's just going to keep adding more to the pile. He warns her to speak up if it gets to be too much and she starts falling behind. But Hyena just looks at his 7 circles and tells him that should be her line, not his. The two of them continue their high-level duel while a person in a white cloak watches from the side. The stranger keeps a close eye on the fight, staying quiet as the magic keeps flying, and then some other guy walks up to the edge of the clearing looking pretty impressed. It's Duke Levi Sagria, and he just smiles while noticing they're both going all out again. Hyena spots Lord Levi and immediately calls him out, asking if he's slacking off and sneaking away from his job again. He just winks and tells her there's no way he can deal with all those political problems without taking a break every now and then. Hyena repeats that last part like she doesn't believe him for a second, while Levi just laughs and sticks to his story, making Hyena wonder how a guy like this is actually the head of a major noble house. He tells her it's only possible because his assistant is so good at her job, leaving Hyena to just let out a long sigh. Levi gets a bit more serious for a second though, looking over at the ongoing fight, and one of the people watching with him comments on how Hyena really is something special. Levi looks over and asks if that's how it looks to her as well, keeping his eyes on the action. He says the girl is totally off the charts compared to everyone else, but then he wonders out loud why someone with that much talent wasn't just brought in through the normal way. The guy looks away, thinking about how even though Hyena is strong, people still hate the idea of a commoner getting a top spot. He mentions the prince spent 10 long years building up his own power and a solid reputation just so he'd finally be able to protect Hyena himself without anyone being able to stop him. Levi gets a look on his face like everything clicked, saying he finally gets it. Hyena really is the prince's favorite after all. The girl next to him agrees but adds there's even more to it, looking pretty serious while she reveals that Hyena was actually the one picked to take over for the famous Bellonia Carlos. The guy next to her completely loses it, asking if she means the legendary former head mage who was known as the Sage of Rigrud. She tells him that's the one, so he points out that she's a total VIP and asks how they even managed to get her on their side. He starts to explain that based on what Hyena told them, it turns out that there's a rumor she actually got kicked out of the royal palace, though he catches himself and acts like he didn't say anything. The guy mentions he heard Hyena actually got exiled, and the girl next to him can't even believe it. She asks if the kingdom of Rigrud is crazy for kicking out a total prodigy like her. Maribel speaks up and says she agrees, but points out that there's a specific reason for it. She reminds everyone that despite her talent, Hyena isn't actually a noble. The guy realizes that commoners get treated like garbage in Rigrud too, and it looks like things are pretty much the same back home in Loster. Levi watches them, thinking about the prince and Hyena while hoping everything goes off without a hitch. He tells the group he's actually found a job that would be perfect for the two of them. It's the kind of high-level work that needs mages with some real power. So Levi lets them know the client is a big shot named Marquis Neppin's Meralda. Evan's got this little smirk going as he mentions that if they can just silence that huge elitist guy, then basically nobody else is going to have anything left to complain about. Levi looks at them and asks if their big plan is really just to use brute force. But Evan doesn't even blink, telling him that's exactly what they're planning to do. Thinking it over, Levi realizes dealing with Marquis Meralda is going to be a massive headache. Yet Hyena throws her hand up in the air, yelling that she's definitely taking the job. She's so hyped she says she'll leave right this second, and Evan jumps in saying he's down too. Levi has to stop them though. He tells them leaving right now is totally impossible since they're both tapped out on mana, so he tells them to get back to the castle and actually rest. He finishes by saying they'll go over the details later, because the whole thing is pretty complicated. It's a quiet night at the castle, with the moon hanging high. Hyena is sitting there looking totally confused and a bit flushed because she thought she was only there to discuss the new mission, but she's wondering why she got thrown into a bath instead of working. Suddenly she hears someone outside yelling for Lady Cynthia to stop, and right then, a girl in a fancy dress slams the doors open. The girl just stands there with a huge, friendly smile, looking at Hyena and asking if that's her name, making Hyena nervously say yes. The girl introduces herself as Cynthia Vel Roster, then immediately asks if Hyena would be willing to talk to her about her brother. Cynthia just keeps on smiling while Hyena tries to wrap her head around the fact that she's talking to Evan's sister. Cynthia reaches her hand out toward the water, her floral sleeve moving as she gets closer. She sits right by the tub and starts explaining that she heard all about the woman her brother brought back, calling her the person who changed him 10 years ago. Cynthia says it's wild enough that Hyena changed her stubborn brother, but that's not even the best part. She's also impressed that Hyena actually kept the promise they made a decade ago. She goes on to say she really wanted to find out why Hyena traveled to another country, and Hyena just looks up at her, asking what she means by her reason for coming. Cynthia asks if it wasn't because they like each other or are in love, which makes Hyena freak out and say no way. Hyena clarifies that she just thought it would be fun if they could be together again like the old days. Cynthia loses it and yells out, asking if Hyena is actually being serious right now, since she can't believe Hyena is so clueless. She tells her she better not be joking about not knowing the real meaning behind that ring she's been wearing this whole time. Hyena just looks down at her hand, finally starting to realize something might be up. She tries to explain that she was just told to hold on to it, so she didn't think it was a big deal, but Cynthia thinks the whole thing is unbelievable. She says it's wild that her brother would just hand it over without explaining anything. Then she gets serious and tells Hyena that the ring is actually what royalty uses for official engagement. Cynthia groans like she's stressed out and tells Hyena to just forget it, saying it's not really her place to say anything more about her brother's business. She ends on a smile, telling Hyena to just trust that Evan had a really good reason for giving it to her. Hyena nods and says she understands, so Cynthia leans in with a smile and asks if Hyena can tell her a bit more about what it was like between her and Evan back in the day. Hyena goes quiet for a second. Then she starts talking about how Evan was actually her very first friend and how much fun they had every single day they were together. But she admits that Evan back then was kind of fragile, like glass. She was always worried that if they ever said goodbye, she'd never see him again. That's the real reason she could never forget the promise they made, because Evan meant everything to her. She thinks back to them holding hands, and a soft, sad look washes over her face while she gets lost in the past. She just really wanted to remember every bit of it. Cynthia mentions that Evan definitely had a lot on his plate back in the day, but Hyena just looks away thinking about how they were really just friends. Cynthia leans on her hand, thinking it over, and says maybe that's actually a good enough reason for everything. When Cynthia catches her looking a bit off, she asks if something is wrong, but Hyena just waves it off, telling her it's nothing at all. Cynthia gives her a huge smile and says she's honestly just happy to see that Hina is actually a good person, because she was worried she might be some kind of crazy villainess. She admits she was totally ready to find a way to kick her out, making Hina look pretty nervous. She repeats the part about being driven out and says that's honestly way too scary to hear. Cynthia explains that she actually asked Evan about Hina a bunch of times before they met, but all Evan ever did was keep it simple. He'd just say that Hina was a good guy or a total genius, which is why Cynthia decided she had to come see for herself. She looks at Hina and says the one thing she noticed is that Hina doesn't treat her brother like he's some special royal. She just treats him like a normal person. Cynthia tells Hina that her normal way of acting must be exactly what made Evan like her, which is why she asks Hina to stay by his side from now on, at least until she eventually gets sick of him. She goes on to say it's actually kind of sad how long her brother has been single, so she really wants Hina to just take him off her hands if she's cool with it, leaving Hina sitting in the bathwater totally lost. The night goes on over the castle as the moon hangs high in the sky, and later on the whole situation changes. Hina thinks back to how she got grilled with a ton of questions about everything, including stuff about the royal court magicians and Rigrud, which is why Evan is standing on the balcony saying he finally understands why she was stuck in the bath for so long. Hina leans on the railing and tells him he's not kidding. She was in there so long she almost passed out from the heat, mostly because his sister is such a huge chatterbox once she starts talking. Evan looks over at Hina and tells her she really should have just cut the talk short if it was getting to be too much, but Hina just smiles back and says it's totally fine. She actually had a pretty good time talking with his sister, so he shouldn't worry. Evan gives her a soft look and says as long as she didn't mind the chatter, then he's fine with it too. Hina stays quiet for a moment, just looking at him with a thoughtful expression as the night air cools down, and then she breaks the silence by calling out his name. Evan just gives her a quick hum to show he's listening. She looks out at the view and says it must have been really hard on him specifically, having to deal with her all this time. Evan looks pretty surprised by that and asks what she means by it being hard to deal with her, since Hina goes on to explain how even though everyone knows she's just a commoner and not a noble, the vibe has changed, and she's noticed that lately, everyone in the whole country has been acting so friendly toward her. Evan looks at her seriously and starts to explain that people are being nice for a reason, and it's all because of how she's handled herself. Hina looks over at Evan and asks if he really spent the last 10 years just preparing for her return, and Evan doesn't deny it, mentioning how it's definitely not an easy thing for a royal to take in a commoner as a personal retainer. He tells her she shouldn't sweat the details though, because he only went through all that trouble because he genuinely wanted to giving her a small smile, as he adds that there was another reason behind it all. He shakes her hand and reminds her it was simply because of the promise they made to each other as kids. Hina looks back at him with a soft expression and just quietly agrees as they stand together in the moonlight. The mood shifts a bit when Hina suddenly asks him why he keeps turning down every single marriage proposal that comes his way, and Evan totally loses his cool for a second, looking pretty stressed while asking if Cynthia was the one gossiping about him. Hina explains that since he keeps rejecting everyone, his sister started wondering if the two of them were actually a couple, which just makes Evan look away and complain that his sister seriously needs to learn when to stop talking. Hina rests her chin on her hand, looking up at the stars as she asks him why he feels that way. Evan looks pretty serious, explaining that everything is just too stuffy and he really just wants to live an easy life. Hina tells him a prince shouldn't be saying things like that, and that he's going to make Cynthia and everyone else cry. Evan just waves his hand like it's no big deal, telling her to just let them cry if they want to. He gives her this soft look and mentions that he might actually consider the idea if it were someone like her. But looking back at the other options, he says they're all just nobles and the whole vibe is way too formal for him. Hina leans against the balcony, asking if that means he'd actually prefer a commoner, which makes Evan jump to explain himself, saying he just wants to be around someone he can relax with like her. He leans back against the stone railing and says he's honestly perfectly happy right now, mostly because he finally got the chance to reunite with Hina after all this time. Evan keeps talking about his wish to just be himself. He laughs it off, saying Cynthia and the rest should just stay out of his business, leaving Hina pretty confused. Hina clasps her hands together on the railing, telling him she's actually really relieved, that he's still the same Evan she used to know, and she thinks that's actually a great thing. Evan just stares at her for a second, totally stunned by her kind words. He gets completely flustered, his face turning bright red as he looks away. Trying to act cool, he stammers a bit and tries to change the subject, saying that now that he thinks about it, since she was taking such a long time in the bath, he and the teacher decided to go ahead and get all the specific details sorted out for their next move. Hina looks over, asking if he's talking about the plan for the monster subjugation, and Evan confirms that's the plan. Evan keeps explaining the situation, telling Hannah it seems like there's been a huge outbreak of monsters over in the Meralda Marquisate lately. And because of that, the people there basically want them to go down and figure out what's actually causing it. He looks pretty serious about the whole thing, saying they need to head out as soon as possible since the plan is to leave tomorrow morning, just the two of them, which Hannah says is fine by her. Evan leans on the balcony and asks if she's actually ever hunted monsters before, and she tells him that most of her work as a royal court magician was doing exactly that, so she won't be a burden. Evan takes a second to look at her, clearly impressed, and starts to say that knowing she's got that much experience is actually really reassuring to hear before they go. The next morning rolls around, with the sun shining bright over the academy as they get ready to leave. Hannah and Evan walk into the room and say good morning to the professor, who's already waiting for them by the magic circles, noting they're actually early. The ground starts to glow with light as the magic activation kicks in, and Hannah can't help but look down in total awe, saying the circle is amazing. The professor asks if this is the first time she's seen 9th tier light magic, so she looks up and tells him that it definitely is her first time seeing it. He starts to explain that this specific light magic connects different circles together, and basically works by teleporting someone from one point to another in an instant. Evan turns to Hannah with a serious look, mentioning that there's a tiny chance they might get separated during the trip, but she just smiles like it's nothing. Evan looks over at Hannah and suggests that they won't get separated if they just hold hands, and Hannah takes a second to process that before simply saying she understands. She says got it and reaches out, firmly taking his hand so they stay together during the jump, which makes Professor Novus give off a pretty satisfied smile while the magic starts humming. Evan and Hannah both give the professor a weird look because of his expression, and someone asks what's up, but Evan just brushes it off and says it's nothing while they stand ready. The professor tells them it's time to start, and the magic circles begin to glow like crazy, making Hannah yell out in surprise as the light completely takes over the room. Even with everything going on, Hannah tries to shout over the noise and asks if the professor could teach her that 9th tier light magic once he gets back, looking totally hyped about learning it. Professor Novus gives a small smile and agrees to teach her that spell once they make it back, and as the light starts to swallow them up, he just tells them both to have a safe trip. The scene shifts to a freezing mountain range. They've arrived at the Marquisate of Meralda, where the teleportation circles finally slow down in the middle of a heavy snowstorm. And just like that, a tall guy with long dark hair stands there waiting. He doesn't look very surprised to see them. Hannah nearly loses her footing from the jump, but Evan catches her right before she can fall, asking if she's all right, while she just catches her breath and tells him she's totally fine. The dark-haired guy steps forward and bows, saying it's been a long time since he last saw the prince. Evan gives a friendly look back and says it's been a while, calling the man Nepins, who admits he asked Levi to send some help, but he never actually thought Evan would show up in person. Evan shrugs off the surprise of him being there, telling Nepins he just had some free time, and then he follows up by asking if the professor told him about Hannah yet. Nepins looks over and gives a simple yes, confirming he's already in the loop, so Evan suggests they stop standing around in the snow and finally get moving, but Nepins stops him right there, saying he's got one thing to ask the prince first. He looks at the two of them and asks if Evan really plans on bringing Hannah along, and Evan doesn't even hesitate, giving him a firm, yeah, before explaining that Hannah is officially his vassal now, and on top of that, she's an incredible mage. He makes it clear he isn't about to let someone with that much talent go to waste, looking Nepins straight in the face to see if he's actually got a problem with it. Nepins looks out over the snowy mountains and admits that if the prince has already made up his mind, he won't fight him on it. But he's not just letting them go alone, telling Evan that he'll be tagging along with them for this whole thing. Evan looks over at him, sounding a little annoyed as he asks if Nepins thinks the two of them aren't strong enough, but Nepins quickly shuts that down, saying that isn't what he meant at all. He mentions there's a rumor he's worried about, bringing up a guy named Meku who saw something terrifying nearby, and according to him, there's a lesser dragon roaming around the area. The news hits hard, especially since Hannah looks completely shocked by the mention of such a creature, her face going pale as she asks him to clarify if he really just said a lesser dragon was out there. It's a huge deal because sub-dragons are known as the absolute peak of the monster world, massive beasts that stand dozens of times taller than any human, making them a nightmare for anyone to face. The power behind a dragon's breath is legendary. A single blast from its massive body can level everything, and word is it takes at least 30 elite mages working together to even stand a chance. Nepins looks out at the freezing mountains and guesses the dragon is probably the reason the weather in the Meralda territory has been so trashed lately, making it way too dangerous for just the two of them. Evan looks back and admits that yeah, taking on a beast like that with only 2 mages is definitely a big ask. But when Nepens asks if he's finally satisfied with the situation, he just says yeah. He isn't sweating it because the way he sees it, they've got Hyena on the team now. He stands tall next to her and tells Nepens that even if a lesser dragon actually does show up, it doesn't matter, because as long as Hyena is there with him, he isn't worried about it in the slightest. Nepens just watches them for a second, noticing how much faith the guy has in her. Nepens looks over at Evan and admits that while he hears him, he doesn't really have a reason to trust Hyena the way the prince does. Evan just smiles and explains that she's basically like a little sister disciple to him, even if she only actually studied under Professor Novus for about 2 months. Nepens can't believe it, thinking that 2 months of training is nothing, but Evan tells him that Hyena is a straight-up genius, and he'll figure that out soon enough. Evan gets a sharp, serious look in his eyes for a second before Nepens finally gives in, saying he'll trust what the prince says for the time being. Since they're on the same page now, Evan asks where exactly the monsters are hiding out. Nepens reaches into his gear and starts unfolding a rugged-looking map, showing 3 specific spots marked with big crosses where the trouble is waiting for them. Evan looks at the map and thinks it over for a second, saying he gets the situation, so he points at a specific spot and asks what's going on at the bottom of the valley. Nepens tells him the place is basically a nest for Mehena now, which leaves Hyena pretty confused. Evan explains that they're 2-legged monsters you only really find in cold places like this, and he adds that they're even known to be spawned by lesser dragons sometimes. Nepens gets serious and says if they're actually going up against those things, they'd usually need at least 3 or 4 knights just to take down a single one. Since their group only has 3 people total, the math definitely doesn't look good for them. Nepens admits he was honestly hoping they could just leave that area for later, but Evan shifts his focus and says they'll start by heading to the high ground first. Evan points out a spot on the map, explaining there aren't many Mehena there, meaning they can skip the other spots. But Nepens just narrows his eyes and adds that there's one more thing, which catches Hyena completely off guard as he looks right at her, saying it's the perfect chance to see how she handles a fight. He admits he's got no clue what she's actually capable of in a real battle, so if she's just going to be a burden, he wants to make that call right now. Hyena takes a second to process the doubt, but then she looks up with this really intense look in her eyes and tells him that she understands perfectly. Evan jumps in to back her up, telling Nepens that Hyena is a total genius, who even Novus recognized, so he really doesn't think there's any reason to worry. Nepens closes his eyes and thinks for a second, still feeling a little unsure about everything, while Hyena tells Evan he's putting way too much trust in her magic. Evan just looks back and asks if he really is. The 2 of them stand there together, and we see that they're still holding hands. Nepens notices and asks if there's some kind of rule forcing them to stay glued together like that. He says he doesn't really care, but it's definitely weird, which makes them both snap out of it and rip their hands apart immediately. Evan starts tripping over his words, trying to explain that he only did it because he heard it was Hyena's first time seeing 9th tier light magic and wanted to help, but she's not having it. Evan tells her to stop making it sound like he was the scared one, but Hyena just yells right back that he was definitely the one who grabbed her hand first. Evan is completely red in the face and starts stuttering at Hyena, yelling that she didn't need to say all that out loud, while Nepens just stares at them and asks if they're actually 16 years old. The wind howls across the frozen white mountains as they keep moving. Evan stops for a second to pull his glove on tight and looks pretty serious. He starts to say something but then trails off, so Hyena speaks up, saying it's not every day you see Nepens struggle like this. Evan asks her if she's sure about that. Hyena tells him he's the type of guy who's usually a step ahead of everyone, then hands Evan his glove back while Nepens looks up at the sky. He mentions how the crazy weather and all these monsters showing up both happened way too fast and without any kind of warning, which makes Hyena stop in her tracks and ask him what he's getting at. Nepens continues his thought, saying this whole thing probably wasn't caused by any miasma from inside their borders, because there's just no way they would have missed a miasma that massive. Evan agrees, saying that makes it way more likely that the lesser dragon actually showed up from outside the territory, and the 3 of them keep pushing forward through the heavy, blinding snow. Suddenly, Hyena catches a vibe and looks off to the side, looking pretty alert, so Evan asks her what's going on, but she just tells him to stay quiet for a second. She narrows her eyes, focusing on the distance, and says she thinks there is something out there. Evan asks if it's another Mehena, but Hyena isn't sure yet. She tells him to hold on a moment and starts getting ready to use some 4th tier extra system magic to figure it out. Hyena stands right in the middle of a huge, glowing magic circle as she starts spotting shadows that look just like monsters through the haze. She starts counting them, getting up to 7, while Evan asks how she can even see through this thick blizzard. But this kind of high-level magic is exactly what Hyena is best at, so she keeps her focus and tells the guys there are at least 10 of them. Nepens just stands there looking completely stunned by her power, which makes Evan grin as he repeats the count of 10 Mehanas hiding in the snow. Evan tells Nepens it's his lucky day because he gets to see Hyena's real skills way earlier than expected. Hyena snaps at him to stop acting so chill and help out, but Evan just asks why he should, since this is her chance to make Nepens trust her. Hyena starts walking off into the blizzard, yelling back that she isn't interested in taking risks for something like that, especially since she's officially his retainer now. She looks back with a serious face and reminds Evan that if she messes up, it's on him too, which Evan just laughs off before asking where the Mehanas are hiding. Hyena points straight ahead and suggests they split the work, but Evan says he's got it. He tells Nepens to just stay back and let the two of them handle the fight, mentioning he was going to jump in regardless of what the Marquis wanted anyway. Hyena suddenly tenses up and warns Evan that they're finally here as a loud screech tears through the wind, with the first monster showing its face through the whiteout. The beast moves fast, lunging out from the cold to start the encounter. Hyena looks up in total shock as the massive Mehana monster shows up. Evan and her are standing right in its path, but she doesn't waste any time and yells out for a 5th-tier fire magic spell. This huge, glowing magic circle forms around her as she starts drawing out all this power, and then a massive explosion of fire just rips through the air and hits the target dead on. Hyena keeps her focus, saying it's not over yet, but meanwhile Evan is just standing there with a smirk, telling Nepens to watch closely. While she's mid-spell, Hyena mentions how this is the exact reason her and Novus call Evan a genius. She gives the command to pierce through and focuses everything she's got on the attack. She shouts for the magic to go right through the enemy as this bright beam of light shoots out, but then she sees something that makes her freeze. Her eyes go wide in shock. Hyena stands in front of a massive glowing crest and calls out for her 5th-tier fire magic to shock Nepenthes, who can't believe she's actually combining 2 high-tier spells at the same time. He just stares at the display and says that what she's doing should be impossible, but Evan explains its magic modification, where Hyena changes the spells instantly to make them even stronger. Evan admits he's never seen anything like it and looks over to ask Nepenthes what he thinks. He keeps going, saying it's amazing every time and that he could never pull off something like that himself. Hyena snaps back at him, asking if he's trying to be sarcastic since, with a mana pool like his, he doesn't even need to worry about copying her techniques. Evan just gives her a look and says whether he can actually do it or not is a totally different story. The monster's clawed foot scrapes against the dirt as it tries to stay upright. Evan and Hyena stand together, looking like total specks against the massive mountain of a creature in front of them. Hyena doesn't waste any time and calls out her 5th-tier fire magic, ready to end this as a massive explosion of energy rips through the air, completely lighting up the entire area. After the dust settles, Hyena gives Evan a look and tells him his mana pool is honestly just unfair. She just stands there with a grumpy face while Evan asks if she's really sitting there thinking about how unfair he is. Nepens watches the two of them bicker, staying quiet and just observing the weirdly close bond they have. Evan casually mentions that things aren't actually that bad, which makes Hyena turn around and ask him what he means. He just gives her a big smile and says that as long as he's with her, he doesn't feel alone at all. Hyena teases him about being a lonely boy, which sends him into a blushing mess as he yells at her to shut up. Nepens watches them and says he finally sees why the prince praises Hyena so much, and Evan just smiles like he knew it all along. Nepens looks over at the two of them and mentions that things were actually looking pretty sketchy just a second ago. Hyena looks confused, so Nepens asks if she's not feeling the shift in the air yet while he explains that the Mehana has officially decided they're a massive threat that needs to be dealt with. He warns her that these things might look like dumb monsters, but they're actually way smarter than they look, and Evan's eyes go wide as he starts to realize exactly what's about to happen next. He yells out that they need to move fast or they're going to take a direct hit, leaving Hyena completely confused. Right then, a heavy rumbling sound starts to vibrate through the entire mountain range. The three of them stand their ground in the deep snow, but the noise just keeps getting louder, and Hyena starts to freak out a little bit, asking what that terrifying sound is supposed to be. Evan looks up at the peaks and asks her what the fastest way to wipe them all out in this much snow would be. Suddenly, the entire side of the mountain just gives way with a massive roar, and a giant wall of white snow starts crashing down right toward them. Hyena realizes what's happening and yells out that it's an avalanche, looking like she's about to lose it, so they all start moving, kicking up snow as they try to get some distance. Evan screams at her to run, and Hyena manages to shout back that she's going, while Evan starts to put the pieces together, figuring out why Nepens only brought the three of them. As they sprint down the slope, Nepens explains that they had to keep the group small, telling them that having more people would have just provoked the Mehana even more. But then he looks over and admits he really misjudged Hyena's power, even if it wasn't how he expected. Evan doesn't care about the small talk and just shouts that they need to get away fast. Evan checks in to see if Hyena is doing okay, and she tells him she's fine, but Evan knows they're in a spot, asking what their actual plan is. Nepens points out that the snow is moving way too fast and will swallow them up, so he decides they're just going to dive straight into the mess. He points out toward the edge of the slope, telling them to look over there, showing them exactly where they need to go as the cliff comes into view. Hyena recognizes the spot, asking if that's the same ravine from the map, while they skid through the powder trying to keep their balance. Nepens explains that if they can just dump the entire avalanche into the valley, all the Mehena waiting down at the bottom will be totally wiped out. Evan thinks the plan to stop the avalanche is actually pretty smart, but Hyena is losing it because they're about to fly off a giant cliff. Evan tells her he can use his magic to soften the landing, but there's still a pretty big problem. Nepens realizes the issue is the snow coming down in one giant piece, and Evan admits he can't stop that much weight by himself. Hyena finally snaps and says she gets it, figuring they just have to work together to smash the snow apart. So Evan agrees but adds that she'll have to sync her magic perfectly with Nepens to make it work. Nepens looks at Evan like he's crazy, asking if the prince is actually being serious about this. Evan just brushes it off, asking if Nepens is only worried because the person doing the syncing has the harder job, explaining that the difficulty is the exact reason he's putting his trust in Hyena. He reminds Nepens that he wanted to see what Hyena could really do anyway, and though Nepens tries to argue, Evan shuts it down, telling them there's no time left to talk as they head straight for the drop. Nepens gets serious and yells out that he's dropping a 5th-tier fire magic spell, summoning 3 massive magic circles in the air that light up the whole sky. Hyena looks up and can't believe her eyes, shocked that he just pulled out 3 of them, but Evan just looks at Nepens and tells him to try and understand what he's doing. He points out that 1 circle is too risky, so having 3 gives Hyena a better shot at matching at least 1. Hyena gets this sharp look in her eye, clearly annoyed that Evan is underestimating her. She calls out her own 5th-tier fire magic, determined to show both of them what she's got. And just like that, the sky fills with matching magic circles as she syncs up with every single one. Nepens is completely stunned that she matched all 3 perfectly, while Hyena just wipes her forehead and Evan gives her the biggest smile, telling her that she really is the absolute best. A huge blast of energy hits the mountainside as Evan moves in, quickly pulling Hyena in close to shield her from the heavy impact. Hyena looks totally stunned as Evan holds her tight, and she can't even react, just watching the magic unfold right in front of her. The entire area gets rocked by these massive beams of light shooting up, and the wind from the blast sends her hair flying everywhere. It's a total whiteout as the magic finally settles down on the mountain. Jumping back to a few hours earlier at the castle, someone calls out, asking if it's true that the 3 of them only knew each other for a few months. Back then, Hyena and another girl were practicing together inside these giant magic circles. The long-haired man looks over at Cynthia and addresses her directly. Cynthia looks down, saying she just can't see her brother from back then opening up to people so easily, and the man agrees that when it comes to Hyena, things were different. He explains that Hyena managed to find a way into the prince's heart, which was something even he, as a guard who grew up with him, could never pull off. He remembers how the prince used to be so perfect, polite, and quiet, basically the exact image of the ideal child that every adult wanted him to be. While a young Evan stands there looking stiff, the man asks Cynthia if she remembers that it was all just a front, and the truth was that the prince was actually completely worn out and stressed. He was just tired of playing the role that all the adults forced on him. The guard looks down with a really regretful expression, admitting that even though he could tell the prince was struggling, he wasn't able to help him at all. He says Hyena was the only one who truly saved the prince's heart. Back then, Evan and Hyena looked so happy just being together, and during one of those days in the woods, the prince confessed that he felt like he was losing his real self. Hyena sat there with him under the trees, just listening. She repeated his words back to him, asking what he meant by his true self, so Evan looked away, looking pretty uncertain. He told her he wasn't really sure how he was even supposed to act anymore. He explained that he knew he had to play the part the adults wanted from him, and that it was supposed to be the right way for a prince to be, but while the guard watched from the shadows, Evan admitted that he thought the whole act was just boring and stupid. He looked straight at Hyena and told her he actually liked the person he was whenever he was with her. Leaves drifted down around them while he wondered out loud what he should do about everything, leaving Hyena just watching him silently, clearly moved by how much he was opening up to her. Hyena looks at him and admits she doesn't really get all the complicated stuff, but she tells Evan he should just do whatever he thinks is best for himself. Evan repeats her words back, looking totally stunned that he actually has a choice, so Hyena gives him a warm smile and promises to support whatever path he picks. She goes on to say that even if he isn't the right kind of prince, or even if the whole world rejects him, she'll still accept every single part of who he is. Hyena beams at him, saying it's because she's friends with the Evan standing right there in front of her. Evan is completely speechless, looking like those words hit him harder than anything else ever could. The guard mentions that while eavesdropping isn't exactly something to be proud of, he noticed that ever since Hyena said those words, the prince has honestly been a changed man. Levi looks back on everything and says that was the moment he finally realized something. He told Hyena he really wanted her to stay by the prince's side to understand him, thinking that if she could just stay close, she could be a real support for the prince since the poor guy isn't even allowed to act his own age. Levi walks off and leaves the two of them alone to talk. The kids just stand there together in the garden. He knows Hyena must be a huge comfort to Evan, especially since they've been through so much, and hearing the whole story, Cynthia finally gets it. She says she sees why he cares about Hyena so much. Levi nods and says he definitely wants to keep supporting the prince, but he also thinks that if Hyena is really the one who managed to change Evan's heart like that, then it means she's become someone completely irreplaceable to him too, which is why he's looking out for her. Everything stays quiet while the snow keeps falling over the high mountain peaks in the distance. The snowy mountainside stays quiet for a second as the wind blows through. Suddenly Hyena bursts right out of the deep snow, gasping for air. She looks around with snow still stuck to her hair, asking what just happened. Then a hand reaches out toward her as Evan calls her name. He's sitting right there in the snow, gently touching her face and asking if she's hurt. Hyena just stares at him and blushes, quietly saying his name, but then she realizes she's leaning on him and panics, asking if she's too heavy. Evan tells her she's totally fine, and the two of them just sit there together for a moment, before he brushes his hair back and notes they got separated from Nepenthes. He stands up and looks over the snowy landscape, mentioning he cast a defensive spell. Evan mentions he put a defensive spell on Nepenthes before they fell, so he's pretty sure the guy can hold his own, but as he's talking, Hyena notices something that makes her freeze up. She looks closer and sees a huge dark bloodstain soaking through the back of Evan's white coat. Hyena panics and yells out Evan's name, telling him he's bleeding everywhere. Evan looks over his shoulder at the wound and acts like it's nothing, saying he probably just scraped it against some rocks. He gives her a calm look and says he just messed up his magic control a bit, telling her she shouldn't worry about it, but Hyena doesn't buy it at all, telling him she's obviously worried and asking how something like this happened. Evan just looks at her and repeats that it's totally fine. He reaches out and pats her on the head, saying that as long as she isn't the one who got hurt, everything's okay. He accidentally hits a tender spot on her head while patting her, and Hyena winces, letting out a quick yelp from the pain. Hyena steps closer and demands to see the wound. She's not letting this go, and Evan tries to wave it off with a smile, telling her it's totally fine and he's okay. But Hyena just looks at him with these really serious, sad eyes and says his name, which makes Evan realize he can't win this one, so he finally gives in and says he gets it. Hyena tells him she's going to touch the injured spot now, and Evan just agrees while she holds her hand out, casting a second-tier healing spell to fix the damage. As the magic starts working, Hyena asks him why he even tried to hide the wound, so Evan looks away, sounding a bit embarrassed as he asks if the whole thing is pretty lame. He explains that he said he'd handle everything, but then he just failed and got hurt. But Hyena looks at him and reminds him that he only got injured because he was protecting her and Nepenthes. Hyena keeps her hand steady as she heals him, telling Evan there is absolutely nothing uncool about what he did. Evan looks at her and admits he really just wanted to show off his skills as a mage, but he gets quiet for a second looking like he has something else on his mind. Turning his head slightly, he adds under his breath that he wanted to show off as a man too. Hyena catches the sound but not the words, so she asks him if he just said something, leading Evan to just give her a gentle smile, saying he's honestly just glad he could protect her. Hyena looks away, sounding a bit playful as she mentions she can't even tell which one of them is the retainer anymore. Evan can't help but laugh at that, telling her she's totally right about how weird their roles have gotten. Moving on, Evan changes the subject as they look over at a dark cave entrance nearby, noting that they've both burned through way too much magic, so they should probably head inside to rest for a while. The two of them step further into the cave and see these bright crystals glowing and sharp. Moving on, the whole place opens up into a massive cavern filled with crystals hanging everywhere. Hyena stops and looks around, saying it's honestly amazing how beautiful the cave looks, but Evan isn't as relaxed. He points out these are Sauca crystals and says something feels off, so Hyena asks him what's wrong. He looks pretty serious as he explains to her that Sauca crystals are actually incredibly rare, and it makes no sense for this many to be packed into one single location like this. Evan keeps thinking it through, saying that even if that crazy blizzard outside is the cause, there is still just way too much going on for it to be natural. Things out there are clearly escalating. Hyena looks concerned as she starts connecting the dots, thinking about the storm, the swarm of Mehena, and how the massive amount of crystals here is just one more thing that's totally abnormal about this place. Evan looks deep into the cave and asks if there might be something hidden further down here. He thinks it over, mentioning that Nepenthes did say the bottom of the valley was the most suspicious spot, so Evan asks if they should try heading further in, but Hina just asks why he's even questioning her. He looks back at her and points out they can't really split up right now, and while he wants to move forward, he says he'll stay back if that's what she wants to do. Hina looks a little hesitant, but admits she's actually pretty curious about what they might find ahead. Evan gets all hyped up and says it's decided then, making Hina wonder why he's suddenly so happy. But as they start walking, Evan tells her she's really the only person who actually puts up with how selfish he can be sometimes. He gives her a warm smile and tells her that besides all that, she's the one who always understands him. Hina stays quiet for a second, just taking in everything Evan said with a soft look on her face. As they keep walking, she tells him he's definitely giving her too much credit, but Evan just gives her a warm smile. She starts blushing and looks away, feeling a bit overwhelmed by how much he trusts her. Suddenly, Evan stops and tells Hina to look over there. Something caught his eye, and he points out a bright light shining through a gap in the rocks just ahead of them. Hina agrees that he's right. They move toward it and find themselves in a massive, open chamber. She realizes they've finally reached the deepest part of the valley. She looks totally shocked by the sight of a giant, spiky object sitting right in the middle of the cavern floor. Evan stares up at the massive thing and asks if it's just a huge block of ice, while the crystalline shards glow in the light, showing something strange frozen deep inside the jagged peaks. Evan stops dead in his tracks, staring at the sight. He can't believe what he's seeing, and there it is, a massive beast frozen right in front of them. Evan asks if that thing is really an ice dragon standing next to Hina, who looks just as stunned. Evan starts panicking, reminding her she said they were only dealing with a lesser dragon, but this is way different. He says nobody told him they'd run into a high-tier monster like this, and he starts charging up his magic. He tells Hina they have to kill it now before it realizes they're there, but Hina quickly grabs his arm to stop him. She tells him to wait because she noticed something: the dragon is actually injured. She points out that it's covered in wounds all over its body, which is crazy because ice dragons are supposed to be at the top of the food chain. They're way stronger than lesser dragons or any other monsters in the area. Since they're so powerful, they don't usually go around attacking humans for no reason, and Hina finally puts the pieces together. She realizes this dragon being here is exactly why that blizzard was so intense. Hina looks at the dragon and realizes it was just trying to hide away to heal its wounds. Evan starts putting the pieces together too, asking if the dragon summoned those Mehena monsters just to keep people away. Hina mentions that a high-tier monster like this should actually be able to speak human language, and she thinks that since it's hurt, there might be a chance for them to actually reason with it. She tells Evan she'd really rather not kill a wounded dragon if there's any other way. But suddenly, a deep voice chuckles from the shadows, asking Hina if she actually pities a creature like him. The ground cracks as a massive ice claw slams down right in front of them, and the dragon glares at them with those cold eyes, calling Hina a foolish human for even thinking that. It roars out that it hasn't sunk so low that it needs pity from any human, and the pressure is so intense that Evan immediately grabs Hina, yelling at her to get back before things get ugly. Evan looks over at Hina and sees how much this is weighing on her. She's clearly torn about what to do, making him decide to take action. He reaches out and triggers a powerful 5th-tier fire spell to handle the threat, but the dragon isn't having any of it. It glares at them with one massive, angry eye and calls them insolent for even trying. Everything goes sideways when the fire magic just shatters into pieces. Evan can't believe his eyes as his attack is stopped dead. He stays focused, trying to figure out what just happened while the pressure in the room ramps up. He's practically speechless. He starts to say something but stops when he sees his magic completely fail him. The dragon's massive claw hits the ground, and Evan realizes his spell wasn't just blocked, it was nullified, leaving them both wide open. The dragon looks down at them like they're nothing, calling them both foolish humans for thinking they stood a chance. It roars that the fact a lowly human like Hina actually felt sorry for him is a crime, one that it says is worth 10,000 deaths. And now the two of them are stuck facing the dragon's full, terrifying rage. Hina suddenly lets out a cry of pain as something hits her, and both she and Evan can only watch in total shock as the situation gets even worse.